are going to go a little bit slower than the book for the next couple of weeks. So much happens in England that influences not only our tradition, but a lot of the traditions around us. A lot of churches in the United States do stem from either the Church of England or reactions against the Church of England. I mean, you figure the two biggest groups in the United States are the Southern Baptists and the United Methodists, after the Roman Catholics. And so the Baptists were in reaction against us. The Methodists, we won't talk about them until later because they split off in the 1700s. But anyway, so we will spend a little more time on England because of that. Real quick, last week we started with the Reformation on the continent in Germany, talked about October 31st, 1517, Luther nailing his 95 debate topics up, talking about how that still nobody recognized that as the official start date. The English Reformation, however, will not have a discrete start date like that. It will be phases and stages, as Willie Nelson used to sing. It'll kind of overlap a lot of. Is the microphone not plugged in? Oops. We just plugged the microphone in, so you may not have heard me well until this point, but anyway. So English Reformation actually overlaps a lot of what's going on the continent. And so we're backtracking a little bit in some ways, but it's not going to be so cut and dry. We'll get to that later. If you look on the map, we showed this map last time. Last time we focused on mainly Germany and Switzerland as the two centers. Calvinism heavily started there, and then Lutheranism here. England will show up as Church of England later, and Calvinist, Church of Scotland, Presbyterian. We'll get to that next week. And then some Roman Catholic stuff in Ireland and northwestern Scotland. But that's kind of the lay of the land here. We talked about the presenting issue last week was purgatory and indulgences. And but the deeper issues were who's in charge, what's the authority of the church, what's the authority of the Pope, what's the authority of Holy Scripture. Does Scripture trump the Pope, or does the Pope trump Scripture? Who gets the final say? There's also discussion about what is the means of salvation. So we talked about that. All right, so the English Reformation being different here. The gross oversimplification is, you often see this, Henry VIII founded the Church of England. It's a horribly, there's a grain of truth there, but it's as bad as saying Columbus discovered America, which is actually from about the same time period, roughly a couple decades. Columbus didn't discover America. Henry didn't found the Church of England, but he had a role to play in what would eventually become the Church of England as we understand it today. The reasons, and we'll go through these in more detail, but the thumbnail is that the Church of England pre-existed King Henry. He didn't invent the church in England. It wasn't a pagan country until then. Henry, we'll get to this later too, mostly made a political split. It was not really a reformation in the same way it was on the continent until he dropped dead of old age and his heirs took over. So take that with a grain of salt. And we talked about back in November that the church in England had deep roots. The legend was that Joseph of Arimathea, who may have been Jesus's uncle, brought the Holy Grail to England and may have taken a child Jesus with him on a business trip. Okay, legend. What we do know, fact, I said this back in November too, there were Christians in Britain by the end of the first or definitely the beginning of the second century. So late O's or early 100s. Tertullian mentions that there were British Christians by 208. So he doesn't say much about them, but he just mentions them in passing. And we know that there were a number of British bishops who attended some conferences in the early 300s. So the Church of England was up and running enough that they were able to send bishops. They were poor bishops. They were the only bishops who went on scholarship. I talked about that in November because they couldn't afford the trip. But anyway, but they were there. Oh, shoot, Jimmy, what did I just do? There we go. Rome pulled out of Britain in 410. The Roman Empire pulled back and kind of left the island off to its own devices. And so British Christianity had a couple centuries of complete independence. It was Celtic in identity during that time because there was no Roman overlay anymore. St. Patrick, famous guy from this time period, we talked about him before, son of a British deacon, enslaved in Ireland, escaped, came back as a missionary. Later, Ireland his successors sent Columba from Ireland to Scotland. So it was a very fertile church. 200 years after Rome pulled back, the Roman Empire pulled back, Saint Gregory, Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, sent St. Augustine of Canterbury to become a missionary bishop to convert England. And so the English church had fallen off the Roman radar screen in those 2 centuries. They didn't have Google, didn't have extensive record keeping, but he got there and found that the local chieftain's wife, the queen, was a Christian. So his dreams of converting the entire island were dashed because there were already Christians there. But what happened in this time period is that you do now have a papal guy in Britain, and there were tensions, and we talked about this back in November as well. There were tensions in the customs between the Celtic Church that had grown up over a couple hundred years independently, and the Roman Catholic Church trying to reassert its authority. And just so we're not flippant here, but this is a problem with history. 200 years, historically, that's nothing. Well, think about what was Texas like 200 years ago? Mexico, it's part of Mexico, 1822. In fact, Mexico had just been independent for a year. Wasn't it 1821 that Mexico won its independence from Spain? That's a heck of a long time. So imagine, that's before the Alamo. Remember the Alamo? So, the English church had a long couple of centuries, and really another half century until the Celtic church acceded to Roman authority and said, okay, we'll follow the Pope here, 664. So really 200 to 250 years of independence before being brought back into the Roman Catholic fold. That would still be in the DNA and in memory in the 1500s. All right, Henry VIII, the second Tudor king. His dad, Henry VII, was the first, War of the Roses, all that good stuff. Born in 1491 and then reigned fairly young, 1509 to 1547. And we can say lots about Henry VIII. Our culture loves this time period. I just pulled a few of the movies and things from Henry and his descendants from this time period. Some of them have Henry or Mary or Elizabeth as main characters. Some of them have them as supporting characters. But there are a slew of good movies and some tawdry things too. But there's a slew of stuff. We love this time period. So there's lots more we could say. There are great biographies of Henry and the Tudor period that we're not going to be able to touch on. The 6 Wives of Henry, all that. We'll deal with a few wives. In fact, 6 is a brand new musical, but the 6 Wives. It just started when COVID slammed down. There's one song from it that's really good. I forgot what it was. But anyway, okay, so it's part of our culture. We love this time period. All the beheadings you get in all those movies. All right. So Henry, he was a Catholic monarch. We forget that. He stayed a Catholic. He loved Catholicism as a whole. Now, he got in conflict with the Pope, but that didn't change his inner Catholic sensibilities at all. At the same time, Henry VIII, Machiavelli's a prince, had been written already a few decades before. Henry was Machiavellian, and just if Machiavelli had anybody in mind, Henry would be a great role model for a Machiavellian type operator. I mean, he was ruthless. He used the headsman's axe to secure his throne. Any threats out there were dubbed treasonous and off with their heads. So that was, you watch those movies, and that's very much a part of the plots of all those. So we've got this kind of conflict between this Christian monarch who's also a very ruthless earthly monarch as well. And later those two will be in direct conflict with each other, those two sides of Henry VIII. Henry was the son of Henry VII, and he was not supposed to be king. His older brother was supposed to be King Arthur, but Arthur died when Henry was a kid. Arthur was groomed, but he died a young death. And so Henry became the heir apparent at age 10. Guess what, kid? You're going to be on the throne one of these days, assuming you live. And he became king just a tad shy of his 18th birthday. And 2 weeks into his reign, he had to get married. And he had to get married to Arthur's widow, who was a Spanish princess that was 5.5 years older than he was. In fact, they had a betrothal and all this. She and Arthur had only been married 20 weeks, and she claimed, and her lady-in-waiting tried to verify it, that they had never consummated the marriage. Okay, maybe not. But this wonderful Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the famous Ferdinand and Isabella, 1492, Columbus, reconquering Spain, all that. That's her folks, her parents. And she's the aunt of the later Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, we talked about last week, and we'll talk about him again soon. All right, so Henry and Catherine actually got betrothed when he was 12. Poor kid, this 17-and-a-half-year-old woman, and he's betrothed to her at age 12. And knows that when he gets old enough, he's got to marry her. So much for romance back in that day. And because she had been married to his brother, they needed a special papal dispensation to allow him to marry baby brother. And she claimed it was never consummated, but just in case, Dad, Henry VII, asked the Pope for a broader, you could get a non-consummated waiver, but just in case it was consummated, let's get the bigger waiver of permission from the Pope. All right, now why do you need the Pope involved with this? Well, you've got dueling scriptures. Leviticus says, if a man marries his brother's wife, it's an act of impurity. He has violated his brother, and the guilty couple will remain childless. Deuteronomy, on the other hand, and Jesus has actually asked a question on this scripture, if two brothers are living together on the same property, one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to anyone from outside the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. Now, I don't want to get into too much of a side alley of trying to interpret these two scriptures, but it's clear that some interpretation is necessary. At face value, these two scriptures are in conflict with each other. They take some interpretation. There's several strategies you could try to reconcile them, but that's why you need the Pope to rule, because there is something here that needs some judgment. Yeah.
Well, does the Leviticus part contemplate the death of the original husband?
It seems to be suggested there. And then, one of the questions is living together on the property, all that stuff. We don't want to go down, we don't need to reconcile those today. Just the fact that there is a question is why some interpretation is needed. Yes.
And there's also the issue that John the Baptist brought it up with Herod and Herod's wife, and that I think really bothered because it's in the gospel.
Yeah, and yeah, John the Baptist with Herod's brother's wife, and yet Jesus is also asked about the seven brothers who married the same woman, and so it was a live question in Jesus's time too. So, all right. Now, because of Henry's later portraits as the old fat guy, we sometimes forget at 17, almost 18, he was a very vigorous, athletic young man. That's supposedly a picture of him jousting. Jousting was not done for war anymore, but it was done for fun. And Catherine is watching from the stands there, Catherine of Aragon. So the young Henry was a much different guy than the older Henry as far as being energetic. And somebody forwarded me this wonderful website that they try to take ancient pictures and ancient sculptures and use computer mapping and all that to try to say what they would look like in 20th century dress and haircuts. And that's maybe what Henry, kind of a better approximation for our eyes. These old paintings look so dull. He also does that to Disney characters and the famous paintings like the Mona Lisa. What would the Mona Lisa really look like? Anyway, Henry VIII. All right, Catholic monarch. Let's talk about that for a second. Very religiously conservative. Remember, conservative in the Reformation is closest to the Roman Catholic end of the spectrum. Radical, extreme Protestantism, left-wing Protestantism is getting as far away from Roman Catholicism as you can. Left and right are a little bit inverted because we think of that being more conservative. No, being Roman Catholic in the Reformation spectrum is the conservative end. So Henry is very conservative from that standpoint. In 1521, the year Luther was excommunicated, the year Luther maybe said, "Here I stand," but certainly was excommunicated, the Diet of Worms, Henry wrote a theological treatise against Lutheranism and the Lutheran view of the sacraments. And there's good evidence that he actually may have written it and not just had his guys write it for him. He could have asked bishops and priests to help him out with it, but it looks like he was sharp enough that it really may have been from him. He may have written Greensleeves too. That's up. he definitely wrote some songs. There are some songs out. So talented guy. But he wrote this defense of Catholicism against Lutheranism. And the Pope, and this is the third Pope after the guy that gave the dispensation for the marriage, the Pope said, Henry, thank you. That is a wonderful, learned, I'm so glad we have learned Catholic monarchs like you floating around the world while we have these awful Lutherans giving us trouble in Germany. Henry, because of that, I'm bestowing on you the title Fidor Defense, Defender of the Faith. If you think this is a small title on Elizabeth's coinage, still in England, Fide Defensor or FD, or Fid Def on some coins, depending how you select, they still use that title. In fact, Prince Charles has been talking about, maybe I need to change it when I become king from Defender of the Faith, one faith, to Defender of Faith. And he's gotten some pushback on that, actually. No, we want you to be Defender of the Church of England. And, but that's a live question. You know, when they had the Commonwealth, they had to drop that in Pakistan first, because that was a part of the Commonwealth. They were Muslim. And so but it's a live issue still, but it's still on the dang coin. So, Defender of the Faith. So it's important. So this wonderful title is bestowed on the English throne by the Pope, and they still use it. Here's another wonderful picture here. Three guys there, three lead guys. You've got Henry VIII and the Pope, and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who's also the King of Spain. And at their feet is a dragon with a spike through its neck. The three great Catholic guys are defeating Protestantism, the dragon of heresy and Protestantism at the bottom there. Henry and Charles and the Pope. All right, so Henry is not some closet Protestant that's just waiting for a chance to do a Reformation. He is Catholic through and through. All right, really doesn't have a religiously Protestant bone in his body. Even as late as 1536, when he and the Pope are in heavy conflict politically, Charles, and there really has been a break, Henry hasn't gotten excommunicated yet, but Henry still asked Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to capture a heretic from his kingdom, this guy named William Tyndale, who's been translating the Bible into English, dang Protestants. And sure enough, Charles captures him, and Tyndale is strangled and burned. The strangling part is the merciful part. And Tyndale says, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Open the King of England's eyes to become much more tolerant of Protestantism and scripture and all that. Tyndale's a saint on our calendar of saints. Great translation. In fact, the King James owes a lot to Tyndale's. I forget what the numbers are, but something like 80% of King James is Tyndale that they just updated a little bit. So Henry is not sympathetic to Protestants in his kingdom, or even if they've escaped from his kingdom into the neighboring kingdom. I mean, Tyndale was publishing Bibles in Holland and shipping them back to England, and Holland was under Charles V, and so that's why. All right. So, devout Catholic monarch, but also that ruthless Machiavellian guy. These movies, again, lots of heads falling in these movies, Henry and his successors. All right, so Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, 18 years of marriage, 1527. At that point, they'd had 6 children, but most of them died in childbirth or the first week. One of them lived to 2 months and died. Only one lived past that. A daughter named Mary. And so at this point, they've got one daughter. They've had all these dead babies, 5 dead children in their lives. And Catherine's getting up there, 42. I mean, that's pretty old in the Tudor realm. Henry's 36. He's no spring chicken himself. And Henry really wants, and he really thinks he needs a male heir. There had never in England been a queen regnant. Regnant means ruling queen, the queen who's in charge. There have been queen consorts, married to the king who's in charge. There had been queen regents who were mothers of a minor king until the king got old enough to speak for himself. But there'd never been a ruling queen. Ironically, 2 of the toughest people ever to hold the British throne were 2 of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. But at this point, there had never been a queen. They could hold their own with many of the kings of history in England. Tough ladies. But at that point, it still never happened. Plus, remember War of the Roses, Henry VII, Tudor Dynasty. The reason the Tudor Dynasty, the reason Henry VII was king is because there had been a civil war between the Lancasters and the Yorks over succession for decades in England in the 1400s. And so that was recent memory. I mean, my dad, his parents got married from both sides of those two houses to make the Tudor house. So he doesn't want another war of succession if he dies. And so male heir is what he thinks he needs. And it doesn't hurt that he's found his eye is cast on this young 26-year-old lady in waiting named Anne Boleyn. And so he's kind of got the hots for her, which is a side issue too, but also plays into the big picture here. So 1527, Henry appeals to the Pope, and this is the second Pope after the one who made him Defender of the Faith, and 5 popes after the one that gave the original dispensation, and said, I need to have my marriage annulled. Okay, yeah, it's been 18 years, but we need to have it annulled. Roman Catholic Church still annuls marriages today. And Henry pulls out the scripture about man marrying his brother's wife, act of impurity, and the guilty couple will remain childless. Well, they have a daughter, but if you need a male heir, that's almost as bad as being childless. And then under normal circumstances, Henry would have gotten the dispensation. He would have gotten an annulment. But this is not normal circumstances. We're in the throes of the Reformation right now on the continent. And 1520s, who is the great defender of the faith on the continent? Well, Henry may be defender of the faith in England, but the guy with the big armies is Charles V/Charles I, Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope needed Charles to stay in his court on his side. And so he doesn't want Henry to be able to divorce Charles's aunt, cause a rift between the Spanish and the English, and so he refuses it. And remember, we looked last week, Charles is the orange and the yellow, direct control of those territories. And he had green allies. England won't be much of an ally after all this mess, but the orange and yellow, he's pretty powerful dude. And so the Pope refuses to grant the annulment. So for Henry and the Pope, this is important for us. It's not really a religious question that finally decides things. The reasons for and against the annulment really are power politics. European power politics at their most Machiavellian. They're both playing power games. And so Henry, as part of his power game, starts to say, we've got bishops around here. Why are we listening to the bishop that lives way down south in Italy? Okay, yeah, at one point the apostles were there. Peter and Paul died in Rome. Peter was supposedly the first bishop of Rome. But why, 1,500 years later, does some bishop sitting down in Rome get to call the shots in my kingdom? And that actually got some traction amongst a number of folks in England. In 1527, it took years for this to rattle around, but the argument really started rolling and gaining some traction. Why do we listen to the Bishop of Rome? Why should we listen to any foreign bishop? And so eventually, long story short, 5 years later, from 1532 to 1537, so this is a decade after the first asking of the annulment, it is a process, but they sever ties with Rome as far as being in charge of the church in England. And it said point blank, the Bishop of Rome hath no jurisdiction in this realm of England. We're independent. And finally, the Pope, after all this, he let it roll for a while. They did excommunicate Henry VIII in 1538. So when the dust had settled, Parliament said the king is the supreme head of the Church of England. They actually passed a law. It's treasonous to say otherwise, which cost some people their heads, including the great St. Thomas More on the Roman Catholic calendar of saints. Man for All Seasons, great movie, great play. That's the Thomas More. Henry's former friend and #1 advisor off with his head. And the Archbishop of Canterbury became much more important then as the senior bishop in England. And the king may be the head of the church, but the Archbishop of Canterbury is the top religious guy after the king. And Thomas Cranmer was, we'll talk about him again in a moment, but he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and once the Parliament passed these laws, he granted King Henry the annulment. So Henry did marry Anne Boleyn.
What did they do with Catherine?
Catherine refused to acknowledge the annulment. She was Henry's wife till the day she died, as far as she was concerned, and as far as her daughter was concerned too, Mary. She went back to Spain for some, but anyway, yes. She refused. And Anne Boleyn was a whore, as far as she said that point blank. That whore, that Protestant whore, Anne Boleyn. Yeah, I'm the real queen till the day she died. All right. So Church of England had been split off from Rome politically, but Henry was still no Protestant. Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer was. He was very sympathetic. He really was a closet Lutheran for all intents and purposes. But he also knew how the political games were played. And as long as Henry was on the throne, it would not be wise for the archbishop to attempt too many reforms. So he kept his head down to keep his head on.
Services are still in Latin.
Services were still in Latin, with the exception of here's what happened. Here are the major Protestant things that happened during Henry's time, quote unquote Protestant. And really, the title here is important. Scholars, instead of calling Henry's realm Protestant, are now calling it Henrician Catholic. That really, if you're fair, is not Protestant. It's not Roman Catholic either. It's a Henrician Catholic Church during these 15 years. So here's what did happen. Clergy were allowed to marry, but then later they walked that back. You have these advisors that lean more Protestant, these advisors that lean more Catholic. And, Henry's playing the games with his court and all that, and Parliament. And so clergy are allowed to marry, then they're not. Then they get to eventually again anyway. Henry does seize and close all these monasteries in England. Maybe that's religious, but a lot of that's economic. They've got land, they've got money, they've got endowments. Oh, those all belong to the crown now. Tough to be a monk, isn't it? Some of the monks were given parishes if they were priests, but a lot of monks were kicked out in the street.
And a lot of monks and friars were loyal to the Pope too.
And a lot of monks and friars are very loyal to the Pope, and so that's reduced their powers. They did print a Bible in English, the Great Bible. Ironically, it was mostly Tyndale's translation after Henry had him strangled and burned at the stake 5 years earlier. So Tyndale kind of had the last laugh from that standpoint. Scripture was in English. Actually, Tyndale during the trial said to a bishop, if God wills it, in a few years, the kid who drives the plow will know more scripture than you, my Lord Bishop. We're going to make sure that these people know their Bible, which you apparently don't, Bishop. Okay. And also they translated one service, the Great Litany, which you often do during a time of war, to pray for the king and pray for the country. They translated that into English. But the rest of the services were still in Latin. Great Litany, by the way, it's in our prayer book. September 11th, 2001, we had a quick service we put together. One of the first things we did is pray the Great Litany. It's a great prayer for times of calamity. They translated that into English. But any kind of Protestant Reformation in England really was on hold until 1547 when Henry died. So here's the setup. Henry had 3 surviving kids by 3 different wives. His oldest was Mary. When he died, she was 31-ish. By Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess. Very Catholic, Mary, as you might imagine. Elizabeth was very Protestant. She was younger. She was only a teenager, daughter of Anne Boleyn. And then there was 9-year-old, almost 10-year-old Edward, who was born in 1537, son of Jane Seymour, who died just after childbirth, a couple of weeks after childbirth from complications of childbirth. So that's the situation. But back in those days, sons are higher in the ranking than daughters. And so even though you got a 31-year-old daughter who's a sharp cookie, Mary, the 9-year-old kid gets the throne, the 9-year-old boy. So Edward becomes Edward VI, King of England. Yes, Jimmy?
I think that's still the case on royal lines.
No, actually, they changed it 11 years ago. Hold off till next week, because we'll talk about that as the British finally changed that. It only affected, you had to go way down because Elizabeth had sons and the sons had sons and the sons had sons. I think it was 28 and 29. They were brother and sister at the time when they changed the law that flipped them from 29 and 28 to 28 and 29. But really, there's so many boys in the pecking order now. It was way down the succession but they have changed that. So the oldest now in England. Spain, you said, still boys. So King Edward, well, England versus Spain. Okay. So Edward VI, 9 years old, takes the throne. and he dies at age 15. So as you might imagine, a king that's 9 to 15 years old is not going to be very powerful. And since mom is dead, she's not the queen regent, but mama's brother is the chief regent. There's a council of advisors that call the shots, and the uncle, who's one of the Seymour clan, is the chief advisor, and they're all Protestants. And Edward's been raised as a Protestant. His mother was Protestant family. And so Edward was Protestant. He actually leaned Protestant, but at such a young age, he's not going to call the shots. That's right.
So when we're talking about Edward being raised a Protestant at this point, it's Henrician Catholicism still?
It's Henrician Catholicism, but Protestant advisors that are aware of what's going on the continent, like the Lutheran or Calvinist kind. Yeah. You know, books are being exchanged, people are going back and forth. I mean, Thomas Kramner was an ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor's court, and he did meet some Protestants, German Protestants in the 1520s. So, yeah, there is exchange, and there are people going back and forth. But yes.
This kind of Protestant is more Protestant than Henry.
Yes, yes. Now, remember I said there were Henry had Protestant advisors and Catholic advisors. Mm-hmm. This was the Protestant side of that bunch.
And they're not necessarily Henrician Catholics.
No, they are more Lutheran Calvinist guys. And by the way, Edward VI, all those off with their head movies, there are a bunch of, it's the kid-friendly movie, Prince and the Pauper, book by Mark Twain, is Edward VI. So the kid-friendly Tudor. So the English Reformation begins under the reign of Edward VI, but he's not calling the shots. Really, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, religiously is the one pushing Reformation. He's got the politics on his side. The king's advisors are all heavily Protestant. And so that gives Cranmer permission to go and put it in overdrive. And he does. He has been waiting 15 years in the position of Archbishop of Canterbury to drive the church to a more Protestant direction. So there's Cranmer, scholar, diplomat, kind of was a dark horse, became Archbishop of Canterbury, young, but very talented man. Lots of connections with those on the continent. But as soon as Edward came on the throne, boom, Cranmer is the one driving the train of reform here. And so Cranmer's genius, Cranmer's greatest gift in the scholarly realm was liturgy, worship. He was a brilliant expert on worship. And he decided that what they needed to do is they needed to bring the country together. We've got these Protestant and Catholic sympathizers. We need to be worshiping in a new way, in a language understanded of the people, his words, in English, basically. So we will be one realm, even though we have different theologies. We need to find a way of worshiping together. And so they translated a new Book of Common Prayer for the realm. There was 1549 Book of Common Prayer, and during Edward's time, there's actually a 1552. We'll talk about that in a second. So 1549, for the first time, all the worship is in English. Eucharist, morning prayer services, the Psalter, prayers, and printed up so that somebody with, a wealthy family, but people could actually buy a Book of Common Prayer and take it with them to pray. And if they couldn't, there'd be a big one at their local church that they could use. So Book of Common Prayer 1549, on the spectrum of all the books of common prayer in the history of the Church of England and her daughter churches, including ours, this is the most Catholic Book of Common Prayer out there. They went a Protestant step, some giant Protestant steps, but it still was pretty close to the Catholic end of the spectrum. Because of that, there was a lot of pushback from the more hardcore Protestants that, you call this a Reformation? This is just Catholicism in English. We need to go much, much further and really be reformed here. And so 3 years later, they did a revision, and it was the most Protestant prayer book in the history of our tradition. Amazingly. So just, we're grinding gears here, shifting back and forth. Hard turn towards the left, towards Protestantism. And in our current prayer book, we just prayed Rite One, as we do every Sunday at 8 o'clock. A lot of that is Cranmer's work. Still in Texas, in 2022, we're praying Kramner's words. Now, Kramner translated things into English, but he translated them very poetically. He had a genius of taking ancient prayers from the Orthodox and Catholic liturgies. He brought Orthodox prayers in, which is one of the reasons the Orthodox like us. And he brought them together, brilliant liturgist. Rite 1, and even Rite 2, a lot of the words are translated into modern English, but they're still Kramner's poetry and prose, if you will, prayer language. So very important man to our worship. So our Episcopalian DNA, a big part of it does come from Thomas Kramner. And later that will be picked up and accentuated and emphasized by Queen Elizabeth I, we'll talk about her mostly next week. We'll touch on her briefly at the end here. But this idea that worshiping together is what holds a church and a country together. You can believe different things, but it's this common worship that's the most important piece. That's still a part of our DNA in the Episcopal Church. Trying to be a Big Ten, allowing for folks to have a wide diversity of opinions on side matters, as long as they agree on the essentials. Now, having said that, everybody in the country can go, wow, wonderful, we're Protestant. Just like our world, it tended to be something that was glommed onto more in urban areas and more in university towns. And out in the countryside, the peasants were not so fond of it. In fact, there were some riots with prayer books, and they called them Christmas games. This is just like, the day after Christmas, you have Boxing Day, and the servants get to be in charge for a little while for one day, and the masters are servants. They said, this is a Christmas game. We're just turning the order upside down. And it's that light of a thing. We don't like this at all. So it was not universally acclaimed, oh, wonderful, we're finally Protestant. Some folks said, yes, yay, we're Protestant. Others said, no, this is awful. So now one thing to notice here, 1552, that second prayer book, Edward dies in 1553. There's real question how far the 1552 prayer book got distributed in England before Edward died. Surely it got in the big towns, big cities, but whether it really was even distributed and printed widely enough to make it into the countryside is a live historical issue. So things grind to a screeching halt with Edward's death, because who's next? Mary, Catherine's daughter, staunch Roman Catholic, half English, half Spanish queen. And she is not going, and she is her father's daughter. She is not going to put up with any of this Protestant nonsense. If she's got the power, she's got the power.
So a woman could become the queen if there's no male heir?
That was it. And she is the first. She's the first queen regnant in England. And her baby sister Elizabeth will be the second queen regnant in
so
England.
They didn't go looking for like nephews?
Some did. I mean, there's actually a play. Lady Jane Grey was a Protestant that supposedly held the throne for 9 days before Mary did. She was put down quickly. Mary had a lot of support in the countryside from these Roman Catholic folks. And Jane eventually, Helena Bonham Carter plays Lady Jane, one of her first movies when she was like 18 or 19, young actress, and does a great job. But yeah.
So wait, she was actually killed or just?
She was executed eventually, yeah. It was a really, Elizabeth was almost executed. I mean, these Tudor monarchs did not put up with dissent. They did not put up with people that might be the focus of a revolution. If folks are looking to you as a leader, then that's probably all for you. Elizabeth has Mary Queen of Scots executed later for just those reasons too. I mean, people are thinking Mary Queen of Scots to put on the throne. That's it for her. And Elizabeth it's a tribute actually to Elizabeth's shrewdness that she was able to survive her sister's reign and live long enough to be queen herself. Okay. Queen Mary, nicknamed Bloody Mary. She's really not that much bloodier than her dad was, but that's the nickname. It sticks. Found it wonderful. There's the updated picture of her. She looks like a nice middle-aged normal lady there, the middle 30s, early 40s when she died. And she is a Tudor. She is her father's daughter, tough lady. And because of that, she wanted to put down Protestantism. And she wasn't that bloody. There were only about 300 executions, which is not, it's a over pretty 67 years. That's not 5 years. Yeah, it's not that much. And a number of Protestants ran. Geneva received a lot of Protestants. Guess what happened with Protestants when they came back? They were really hardcore because they'd been schooled in Geneva and found refuge in Geneva and some other places. But there were 3 folks that did not flee, and these were very high-profile executions. Vladimir, Ridley, and Thomas Kramner himself. Vladimir and Ridley were both bishops. Vladimir was in his 70s, Ridley was in his 50s, and they're going to be burned together. And the quote is that Vladimir says, "Be of good comfort and play the man, Master Ridley. Let's go out well. We shall this day light such a candle as by God's grace, as I trust shall never be put out." So we're going to go up in flames, but we'll be the candle that will never be extinguished in England. Protestantism will flame up as we are burned up. And Ridley walked up to the stake and kissed it. After Vladimir said this to him, it encouraged him, and he walked up, I'm going to my death for the sake of God and the true faith, Protestantism. Tough death. Vladimir was overcome quickly, smoke, he passed out very quickly. Ridley, they didn't pile enough fuel up, and he didn't burn. So he kept crying out, "Lord, have mercy upon me, I cannot burn." People are throwing wood and trying to get him burning, and eventually it does. Eventually the fire gets to a pouch of gunpowder they put around his neck as a merciful end for him. We want him to experience some pain, but eventually that'll be all she wrote. So it's a tough execution. And and that story gets out there. These bishops are pretty brave doing this. Thomas Kramner was burned 6 months later. He was made to watch Vladimir and Ridley go up. And at one point, old Thomas Kramner did cave. He signed a recantation. Protestantism is heresy, it's an error. But then he recanted the recantation. He said, "Nope, I did that out of fear, out of weakness, out of my own sinfulness. So I'm going to recant the recantation. And when I go up in flames, the right hand that signed the recantation will be the first that's burned. First part of me that goes up. I'm going to stick it out in flames." And he did. This is the quote. One of the chroniclers says, "Fire being now put to him, he stretched out his right hand and thrust it into the flame and held it there a good space before the fire came to any other part of his body, where his hand was seen of every man sensibly burning." You could see that his hand was crisping up, and yet Kramner held it out there. And he cried out with a loud voice, "This hand hath offended." It signed the recantation. And soon as the fire got up, he was very soon dead, never stirring or crying out all the while. So very, very good martyrdom as martyrdoms go. Very brave. So that actually had a big influence in England. This is not just a Christmas game, maybe. If these old bishops are willing to sacrifice their lives for the sake of Protestantism, maybe there's more there. And so that got things rolling. All right, Mary died young, relatively, 42. Not as young as her brother, but she died young as well. So who's next? Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, Protestant. England goes back to Protestantism under Elizabeth. Talk about grinding gears. We'll talk about this more next week as well. But compared to her siblings, what Elizabeth's triumph is she has longevity. She lives to the age of 69. She's on the throne for 44 years, which is still number 6 in the history of English British monarchs. And so she's able to, with her long life and long reign, cement things the others couldn't. So that stops the grinding gears back and forth. They go. And we'll talk a lot more about Elizabeth next time, but she really is second only to Kramner in our tradition of really cementing things. And she is no slouch theologically. And she's also her father's daughter. She's pretty shrewd politically as well. But a lot of the DNA of who we are comes from the Elizabethan compromise that she really pushed. And it didn't hurt that she lived almost as long as the average lifespan. She was on the throne almost as long as people lived back in those days on average. So that really did cement things. All right, we'll pick up with her next time. And we'll also look at some of those other movements in Britain, Presbyterians up in Scotland, and all the Puritans and Dissenters and Separatists and Baptists and Quakers and stuff, oh my. So we'll look at some of their roots as well. So any questions here? Yeah, Mark.
I noticed that you mentioned that there were several different popes during
Henry's life, like you said, between him being declared the defender of the faith and then getting the annulment was 3, and then 2 between him and then dying, I think.
And then there are more after that too. Yeah,
About how often were they?
Popes, they'd often, you can look it up on Wikipedia. Some of them, go for 5 or 10, 15 years, but other times 1 or 2 years. So there is a lot of turnover, people turnover. And of course, in my lifetime, before your time, but in the 70s, I remember there was a pope for a month, John Paul I. They elected him and he died. There are assassination rumors out there, but he died quickly. So one of the reasons they elected the young Polish pope that they did, John Paul II, was we need to stop this rotation happening. We needed somebody to last for a while. So it's happened before. I mean, John the 23rd, when I was a baby, it was also pretty short, just a few years. They, in fact, thought he was going to be a caretaker. They elected him to be a caretaker, and he did major reforms in the Roman Catholic Church, Vatican II, all that. But
so back then was mainly like disease that would take him out.
Disease, old, no antibiotics or stuff. There were people that lived in their 80s, but a lot of people died in their 40s, 50s, 60s. The average life expectancy in Elizabeth's time was 47.
Maybe just by the time they would get up that high in the hierarchy, they would be, in their 40s.
Right. What's the line? Lion and Winter, Henry II. This is 1200s, but I'm 54. I'm the oldest man I know. I've got a decade on the Pope. I know I'm old. So this is a little bit different conception than we have. And they did have old people, but not as great a percentage in the population. Heavy infant mortality skewed things downward too. Yeah.
This is something from last week.
Yeah.
Puzzled me much. On Calvin and predestination.
Okay, and we'll talk more about that next week too, but go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead and ask. So.
Well, it seems to me if you're predestined to either be going to heaven or you're going to hell, what difference does it make what you did in the United States? I mean, in your life, unless there's qualified predestination.
And that's one of the, the opposite of predestination, Calvinism, is Arminianism. And that's something that will be argued, exactly that line of thought. And there were Calvinists that tended, a few of them were antinomian, which means if I'm elect by God or not elect, and my behavior doesn't matter, so I'll just go out and be wild. But the Calvinist answer would be, well, by your election, you will be known. If you're living a pious life, that's an indicator to the rest of us that you're part of God's elect. And so most of them didn't go wild because of that logic. They tried to live pious lives to prove, maybe even to themselves, that they were God's elect and reassure themselves. But that's a big debate. And actually, it's a debate. The Puritans will get it from both sides. The Calvinists will get it from more liberal Episcopalian or Anglicans. Also, the Baptists arise as an anti-predestination group. We'll talk more about that next week. But yeah, that's a good. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mary, Bloody Mary,
yeah,
was so anti-Protestant. How did Elizabeth make it?
Well, Elizabeth's mother was Protestant. How did she survive?
Keep from getting her head chopped.
It was a dicey thing. There are biographies of Elizabeth out there. She was a teenager, so there were some sympathy. She could maybe play on those sympathies a little bit with Big Sis, who's in her 30s. My wayward little teenage sister, half sister, by that Protestant whore. So there was some of that, and beautifully, Elizabeth had herself buried next to Mary, and she had the inscription carved on their joint tomb. This is going to be 50 years later. Here lie two sisters who share faith in the same God. So eventually, she's able to have some family reconciliation here.
On top of each other.
Are they? Okay.
On top of Mary.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I think the quote is, "You're not two sisters in the hope of the same resurrection."
Same resurrection. I think it's good. Yeah, that sounds exactly right. Good, y'all. Well, we'll stop there and we'll pick up with Elizabeth and some other 1600 things next week.
Mary didn't either.
And Mary didn't have any kids. Yeah, if Mary had a kid, that'd be all she wrote. She was married briefly to a Spanish prince, but the Spanish king. Yeah.
I think she was in a tower, wasn't she?
She was under arrest.
Yeah.
Yeah, in castles.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do they still have them? Yeah, basically talk about purgatory or doing other like translations to the cause and rosary. So they haven't been not fully doing nice devotions that we should be doing anyways.
But so is the time period in purgatory still millions of years?
I think they're eons and stuff.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
And some of them actually, if you do it, it basically, some of them are called plenary indulgences, I think. And